The morning rain fell like bullets against the concrete of Camp Bradley, each drop creating tiny explosions on the gray parade ground. Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the center of the formation area, her olive-green uniform already soaked through to her skin. Water dripped from the brim of her cap, running down her face in steady streams that she couldn't wipe away. Her hands remained locked at her sides, fingers pressed against the seams of her trousers, just as regulation demanded. Around her, the other recruits huddled under the covered walkways and overhangs, their faces pressed against windows as they watched the spectacle unfolding in the courtyard. Some whispered among themselves, their breath fogging the glass as they pointed and stared. Others looked away entirely, unable to watch what was happening to their fellow trainee. "Look at her just standing there like some kind of robot," muttered Private Jackson from beneath the safety of the mess hall awning. His voice carried a mixture of contempt and disbelief as he watched Sarah's motionless figure in the downpour. "Does she really think this is going to prove anything to anyone?" Private Coleman nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. "My dad served 20 years in the Marines, and he always said women don't belong in combat roles. Look at her now, can't even handle a little rain without probably crying underneath that tough act." The other recruits gathered around them, feeding off the negative energy like vultures circling prey. They had all heard the stories about Sarah Martinez, how she had scored higher than any of them on the physical fitness tests, how she had outperformed most of the men in marksmanship training, how she never complained or asked for special treatment. But, standing there in the rain, she looked small and vulnerable, and it gave them a sense of power they hadn't felt since arriving at basic training. "I heard she thinks she's better than the rest of us," Private Henderson chimed in, his voice low and spiteful. "Always acting like she has something to prove, like she's some kind of super soldier or something. Maybe this will bring her down a few notches." The truth was far different from their cruel assumptions. Sarah wasn't standing in the rain because of pride or stubbornness. She was there because of a series of events that had begun 3 days earlier, when she had witnessed something that would change everything. 3 days ago, Sarah had been returning from late-night study sessions in the library, reviewing tactical manuals and military history that went far beyond what was required for basic training. She was dedicated to excellence, driven by a deep desire to honor her family's military legacy and prove that women could serve with distinction in any capacity. As she walked back to the barracks, she had heard raised voices coming from behind the supply building. Curiosity and concern had drawn her closer, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Sergeant Phillips, one of the drill instructors, was forcing a younger recruit, Private Wong, to clean equipment with his bare hands while berating him with racial slurs and threats. The sergeant was drunk, swaying on his feet as he screamed at the terrified 18-year-old who was desperately trying to comply with impossible demands. "You worthless piece of garbage," Sergeant Phillips had snarled, his words slurring together. "Your kind doesn't belong here. Maybe if I make you work hard enough, you'll quit and save us all the trouble of dealing with you." Sarah had watched in horror as the sergeant grabbed Private Wong by the collar and shoved him against the wall. The young recruit's face was streaked with tears and dirt, his hands bleeding from the rough metal he had been forced to clean without proper protection. Every instinct told Sarah to intervene immediately, but she also knew that a direct confrontation with a drunk superior officer could result in serious consequences for both herself and Private Wong. Instead, she had made the difficult decision to document what she was seeing. Using her phone, she had carefully recorded several minutes of the abuse, capturing both the sergeant's face and his words clearly. She had then slipped away undetected and spent the rest of the night wrestling with what to do with the evidence. The next morning, Sarah had gone directly to the company commander's office and reported what she had witnessed. Captain Rodriguez had listened to her account with a grave expression, viewing the video evidence with obvious disgust and anger. He had assured Sarah that the matter would be investigated immediately and that appropriate action would be taken. But, within hours of filing her report, Sarah had discovered that her act of courage would come with a heavy price. Word had somehow leaked to the other recruits that she had reported a drill instructor, though the specific details remained unknown to them. In military culture, there was nothing worse than being labeled a snitch, regardless of the circumstances. The harassment had begun immediately. Sarah's personal belongings had been tampered with, her bed sheets tied in knots, her boots filled with shaving cream. Anonymous notes appeared in her locker calling her a traitor and, worse. During group exercises, she found herself excluded and isolated, with other recruits refusing to partner with her or include her in conversations. The psychological pressure had been intense, but Sarah had endured it all because she knew she had done the right thing. Private Wong was safe now, transferred to a different unit where he could train without fear of abuse. Sergeant Phillips was under investigation and had been suspended from duty pending a formal hearing. But the other recruits didn't know these details. All they knew was that Sarah had broken the unwritten code of silence, and they were determined to make her pay for it. The campaign of harassment had escalated each day, growing more creative and cruel as her tormentors realized that their initial efforts weren't breaking her spirit. Yesterday, they had taken things to a new level. During a formation exercise, several recruits had deliberately bumped into her, causing her to break position and draw the attention of the acting drill instructor. When questioned about the disruption, the other recruits had all claimed that Sarah had been the one causing problems, forcing her to accept punishment she didn't deserve. The punishment had been standard military discipline, an hour of extra physical training and cleaning duty. But, as Sarah had performed her additional tasks, she had noticed groups of recruits watching her with satisfaction, whispering among themselves about how they had successfully turned the system against her. That night, as Sarah had lain in her narrow bunk listening to the whispered conversations around her, she had made a decision. She refused to be broken by their cruelty, refused to let them drive her from the military career she had dreamed of since childhood. If they wanted to test her resolve, she would show them exactly how strong she could be. The opportunity had come this morning when Private Jackson had approached her with a false message. He had claimed that the drill instructor wanted to see her in the parade ground for a special inspection, and that she should report there immediately and waited attention until further orders arrived. Sarah had known it was likely a setup, but she had also seen it as an opportunity. If the other recruits wanted to play games, she would turn their own trick against them. She would stand at attention in that parade ground no matter what they threw at her, demonstrating the kind of discipline and dedication that true soldiers possessed. So when the rain had started falling 20 minutes ago, Sarah had remained in position. When the other recruits had emerged from their barracks to watch her get soaked, she had kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. When they had begun their cruel commentary, she had blocked out their voices and focused on her breathing, on maintaining perfect military bearing despite the water running down her back and the cold seeping into her bones. The rain was getting heavier now, drumming against the concrete with increasing intensity. Sarah's uniform was completely saturated, the fabric clinging to her body and making every movement slightly more difficult. Her boots were starting to fill with water, creating an uncomfortable squishing sensation with each small adjustment of her stance. But she remained motionless, a statue of determination in the midst of the storm. From the covered walkway, Private Coleman laughed loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "Look at her. She's going to stand out there until she drowns rather than admit she's been had. What kind of stupid pride is that?" Other recruits joined in the laughter, their voices echoing off the concrete walls of the surrounding buildings. They had expected her to give up within the first few minutes, to realize she had been tricked and walk away in embarrassment. Instead, her stubborn persistence was providing them with ongoing entertainment. "Maybe we should get some popcorn," suggested Private Henderson. "This is better than anything on TV. I wonder how long she'll actually stay out there before she figures out no one's coming." But, as the minutes ticked by and Sarah remained immobile in the downpour, some of the recruits began to feel uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. There was something unsettling about her absolute stillness, her refusal to acknowledge their presence or react to their comments. It was as if she existed on a different plane entirely, focused on something they couldn't understand. Private Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing a surname, shifted nervously as he watched from the window. "This is starting to feel wrong," he said quietly to the recruit next to him. "Maybe we should tell her to come in. She's going to get sick standing out there like that." But his concern was drowned out by the louder voices of those who were enjoying the spectacle. They had started taking bets on how long Sarah would remain in position, treating her suffering as a form of entertainment. The cruelty was escalating, fed by mob mentality and the safety of numbers. What none of them realized was that their actions were being observed from another quarter entirely. High above in the administration building, General Patricia Hayes stood at her office window, watching the scene unfold in the courtyard below. She had arrived at Camp Bradley that morning for an unannounced inspection, a routine visit to evaluate the training programs and facilities. The general was a woman who had fought her own battles throughout a distinguished 30-year career. She had been among the first women to serve in combat roles, had commanded troops in 2 overseas conflicts, and had broken through barrier after barrier in her rise through the ranks. She understood better than most what the young woman standing in the rain was experiencing. General Hayes had been briefed on the recent incident involving Sergeant Phillips and the recruit's report of abuse. She knew that Sarah Martinez was the whistleblower who had risked her own standing to protect a fellow soldier. She also knew that such courage often came with a heavy social price in military culture. As she watched the drama unfold below, the general felt a familiar anger building in her chest. She had seen this kind of harassment before, had experienced it herself early in her career. The sight of young soldiers tormenting one of their own, particularly one who had shown moral courage, awakened a protective instinct that had been honed by decades of leadership experience. The general turned away from the window and grabbed her cap and raincoat from the stand beside her desk. She had seen enough. It was time to remind these recruits what military values actually meant, and to show them what real leadership looked like in action. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Sarah continued her lonely vigil in the rain. Water was now pooling around her feet, and she could feel the cold penetrating deeper into her core with each passing moment. Her muscles were beginning to ache from maintaining the rigid position, but she forced herself to focus on the mental techniques she had learned for managing discomfort and stress. She thought about her grandfather, who had served in Vietnam and had told her stories about enduring far worse conditions than a simple rainstorm. She thought about Private Wong, who was now safe because she had been willing to speak up. She thought about all the women who had served before her, breaking down barriers and proving that courage had nothing to do with gender. The voices of the watching recruits seemed to fade into the background as Sarah entered a kind of meditative state. This was more than just standing in the rain now, it had become a test of will, a demonstration of the kind of inner strength that true soldiers possessed. Every minute she remained in position was a victory against those who wanted to see her fail. As the rain continued to fall and the drama in the courtyard intensified, none of the participants could have predicted how dramatically the situation was about to change. General Hayes was making her way down from the administration building, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors as she prepared to deliver a lesson that would be remembered long after the rain had stopped falling. The rain had been falling for nearly 30 minutes when General Hayes emerged from the administration building, her polished boots clicking against the wet concrete as she made her way toward the courtyard. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent decades commanding respect through presence alone. Her gray hair was pulled back in a regulation bun beneath her cap, and, despite the weather, every aspect of her appearance remained immaculate. The general had taken time to review Sarah Martinez's file before coming downstairs. The young woman's record was exemplary, top scores in academics, physical fitness ratings that exceeded those of most male recruits, and commendations from instructors who praised her dedication and natural leadership abilities. More importantly, the report about her intervention in the harassment incident painted a picture of someone with genuine moral courage, a quality that was becoming increasingly rare in any organization. As General Hayes approached the courtyard, she could hear the voices of the recruits who had gathered under various covered areas to watch Sarah's ordeal. Their comments were a mixture of mockery and betting, treating another soldier's suffering as entertainment. The general's jaw tightened as she listened to their callous words, remembering similar scenes from her own early career when she had faced harassment and discrimination that would have driven many people from military service entirely. "She's been out there for almost half an hour now," Private Jackson was saying to a group gathered near the mess hall entrance. "I'm starting to think she might actually be crazy enough to stay until someone comes to get her." "Maybe that's what we want," replied Private Coleman with a cruel laugh. "Maybe if she stands out there long enough, she'll realize this isn't the place for her and just quit. Save us all a lot of trouble." Private Rodriguez, who had been quietly watching from the back of the group, finally spoke up. "This doesn't feel right, guys. We're basically torturing her for doing what any decent person would do. She reported abuse because it was the right thing to do. "Shut up, Rodriguez," snapped Private Henderson. "Nobody asked for your opinion. She chose to be a snitch, and snitches get what they deserve. This is how the real military works." The conversation died abruptly as someone noticed a figure approaching from across the courtyard. At first, nobody could make out who it was through the heavy rain, but, as the person drew closer, the distinctive bearing and uniform became unmistakable. One by one, the recruits began to recognize the approaching figure, and whispers of disbelief rippled through their ranks. Is that a general?" Private Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. "Oh God, we're dead," muttered Private Coleman, suddenly, understanding that their entertainment at Sarah's expense was about to become a very serious problem. General Hayes continued her approach, apparently oblivious to the growing panic among the watching recruits. Her attention was focused entirely on the solitary figure standing at attention in the center of the parade ground. Even from a distance, she could see that Sarah was maintaining perfect military bearing despite being completely soaked and, obviously, uncomfortable. Sarah, for her part, remained unaware of the general's approach. She had entered a state of focused concentration, blocking out the comments from her tormentors and the discomfort of her situation. Her training had taught her to find mental strength in physical challenges, and she was drawing on every technique she had learned to maintain her position with dignity. The water was now running steadily from every part of her uniform, creating small rivers that flowed across the concrete around her feet. Her hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, had begun to escape from its pins, sending wet strands down the back of her neck. But her posture remained erect, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her hands pressed perfectly against the seams of her trousers. As General Hayes drew within 50 meters of Sarah's position, she began to make out the details of the young woman's situation more clearly. The recruit's dedication was evident not just in her willingness to stand in the rain, but in the precision of her military bearing despite the challenging conditions. This was not someone going through the motions or enduring punishment, this was someone demonstrating the kind of discipline and commitment that define truly exceptional soldiers. The general's respect for Sarah increased with each step closer. She had seen plenty of recruits break under far less pressure than what this young woman was obviously experiencing. The fact that she was maintaining such perfect form while dealing with both physical discomfort and social isolation spoke to character traits that couldn't be taught in any training program. Behind her, the gathered recruits were beginning to panic as they realized the magnitude of their situation. A general showing up during their cruel joke was the worst possible scenario, and several of them were already trying to quietly slip away before they could be identified as participants in Sarah's harassment. "We need to scatter," whispered Private Henderson urgently. "If she asks who was involved in this, nobody knows anything. We were just watching from inside because of the rain." But it was too late for escape strategies. General Hayes had reached the edge of the parade ground and was now clearly visible to anyone paying attention. Her presence commanded immediate recognition, and the few recruits who had been brave enough to venture outside despite the weather quickly snapped to attention wherever they stood. The general paused for a moment at the edge of the concrete area, taking in the full scope of the situation. Sarah stood alone in the center of the large space, her isolation emphasizing both her vulnerability and her determination. The other recruits were clustered under cover, watching from safety while one of their own endured conditions they weren't willing to face themselves. What happened next would be talked about for years afterward by everyone who witnessed it. General Hayes stepped out into the rain, water immediately beginning to darken her uniform as she walked steadily toward Sarah's position. She moved with deliberate purpose, her own military bearing serving as a counterpoint to the young recruit's unwavering stance. As the general approached, Sarah became aware of footsteps approaching through the rain. Military training dictated that she remain at attention regardless of who might be approaching, but there was something about the measured cadence of the steps that suggested this was not another recruit coming to add to her humiliation. When General Hayes reached a position directly in front of Sarah, she stopped and studied the young woman's face. Despite the water streaming down her features, Sarah's expression remained composed and focused. Her eyes stared straight ahead, not making contact with the general but clearly aware of her presence. "Recruit Martinez," the general said, her voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "I am General Patricia Hayes. I believe you were told to report here for a special inspection. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this unexpected development. She had assumed that the message from Private Jackson was a cruel trick, but now a real general was standing before her, suggesting that perhaps there had been some legitimate purpose to her presence in the courtyard after all. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her confusion and the physical challenge of speaking clearly through the rain. General Hayes nodded slowly, studying Sarah's bearing and demeanor with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating soldiers. What she saw impressed her immensely. Despite being soaked to the skin and clearly uncomfortable, the recruit was maintaining perfect military discipline and showing no signs of complaint or self-pity. How long have you been standing here, recruit? The general asked. Approximately 35 minutes, ma'am, Sarah replied, estimating based on her mental count of the time that had passed since the rain had started. And, in that time, have any of your fellow recruits offered to join you or expressed concern for your welfare? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah was acutely aware that her answer could have serious implications for the other recruits, but she had always believed in telling the truth regardless of consequences. No, ma'am. They have remained under cover and observed from there. General Hayes turned slightly to look toward the covered areas where clusters of recruits stood watching the exchange. Even from a distance, she could see the anxiety and guilt written on their faces. They knew they had been caught in an act of collective cruelty, and they were beginning to understand that there would be consequences. I see, the general said, turning back to face Sarah. And, what do you think this situation reveals about military leadership and the bonds between soldiers? This was clearly a test question, the kind that could define a military career depending on how it was answered. Sarah took a moment to consider her response, knowing that her words would be remembered and analyzed long after this encounter was over. Ma'am, I believe it reveals that true leadership means standing up for what is right even when it is difficult or unpopular. The bonds between soldiers should be based on mutual respect and shared commitment to honor, not on peer pressure or social acceptance. The general nodded approvingly. And, what about loyalty, recruit? Some might argue that reporting a superior officer, as you recently did, demonstrates a lack of loyalty to the military institution. Sarah felt a moment of surprise that the general knew about her report regarding Sergeant Phillips, but she quickly realized that someone in General Hayes' position would have been briefed on all significant incidents during her visit to the base. Ma'am, I believe true loyalty means protecting the institution from those who would corrupt it through abuse of power. Allowing harmful behavior to continue unchecked damages the military far more than exposing and correcting it. The answer demonstrated both moral clarity and sophisticated thinking about complex ethical issues. General Hayes found herself genuinely impressed by the young woman's wisdom and maturity. These were the kinds of responses she would expect from seasoned officers, not recruits in basic training. Outstanding answer, Recruit Martinez, the general said. Your understanding of military values is exemplary. Then, in a gesture that would become legendary among everyone who witnessed it, General Hayes took several steps backward and came to attention herself. As the senior ranking officer present, she was under no obligation to salute first, but the demonstration of respect she was about to show would send a message that would reverberate throughout the entire base. Slowly and deliberately, General Hayes raised her right hand in a perfect military salute, holding the position with the same precision she demanded from others. The gesture was all the more powerful because it was being rendered by a 3-star general to a recruit, in full view of dozens of other soldiers who had been tormenting that same recruit just moments before. I salute you, Recruit Martinez, for your moral courage, your dedication to duty, and your refusal to compromise your principles despite significant personal cost, the general announced, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The watching recruits stood in stunned silence as they witnessed something unprecedented in their military experience. They had never seen a general salute a recruit, and they certainly hadn't expected to see their victim being honored for the very actions they had been punishing her for. Sarah, meanwhile, felt overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. She returned the general's salute with perfect form, but inside she was struggling to process the emotional impact of this moment. For days she had endured harassment and isolation, questioning whether she had made the right choice in reporting the abuse. Now the highest-ranking officer she had ever met was publicly validating her decision and honoring her courage. After holding the salute for several long seconds, both officers lowered their hands simultaneously. The general then stepped closer to Sarah, close enough to speak in lower tones that wouldn't carry to the watching crowds. "The military needs more soldiers like you, Recruit Martinez," she said quietly. "People with the courage to do what is right even when it costs them personally. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion despite her efforts to maintain composure. General Hayes stepped back and spoke in her command voice again, ensuring that her words would reach every recruit in the area. "All personnel will report to the main assembly hall in 10 minutes for an impromptu training session on military values and leadership principles. This session is mandatory for all recruits currently on base." The general then turned and began walking back toward the administration building, leaving Sarah standing alone in the rain once more. But everything had changed. The cruel entertainment that had motivated her tormentors was now transformed into a demonstration of everything they had failed to understand about military service and personal honor. As General Hayes disappeared into the building, the courtyard remained silent except for the sound of falling rain. The recruits who had been watching from under cover began to slowly emerge, their faces reflecting a mixture of shame, confusion, and dawning realization about what they had just witnessed. Sarah remained at attention for several more minutes, processing what had just occurred and waiting to see if any further instructions would be forthcoming. When it became clear that her vigil was complete, she finally allowed herself to relax her posture and began walking slowly toward the barracks to change into dry clothing before the mandatory assembly. As she walked across the courtyard, several of her fellow recruits attempted to make eye contact or offer words that might repair some of the damage they had done. But Sarah moved past them without acknowledgement, focused on preparing for whatever lesson General Hayes intended to deliver in the assembly hall. The rain continued to fall as the courtyard gradually emptied, but the events of the past hour would be remembered long after the weather had cleared. A young woman's moment of moral courage had been recognized at the highest level, and the price of cruelty had been exposed for all to see. The main assembly hall at Camp Bradley had never felt smaller than it did 10 minutes later as nearly 200 recruits filed in with unusual quiet. The normal chatter and casual interactions that typically accompanied group gatherings were absent, replaced by intention that seemed to press down on everyone present. Word had spread quickly through the barracks about what had happened in the courtyard, and even those who hadn't witnessed the events directly understood that something significant had occurred. Sarah entered the hall still damp from her time in the rain, having had only enough time to towel off her hair and change into a dry uniform. She had chosen a seat near the middle of the assembled group, aware that many eyes were following her movements but determined not to let their attention affect her composure. The whispered conversations that occurred around her were too quiet to make out clearly, but she could sense the mixture of curiosity, guilt, and resentment that her presence was generating. Private Jackson sat several rows behind Sarah, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The image of General Hayes saluting the recruit he had helped torment was burned into his memory, and he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his misjudgment. The cruel joke that had seemed so clever a few hours ago now looked like the petty harassment of someone who had demonstrated more courage than any of them possessed. "I can't believe we're in this much trouble because of her," Private Coleman whispered to the recruit sitting next to him. But his words lacked conviction, and even as he spoke them, he knew they weren't true. They were in trouble because of their own choices, their own cruelty, their own failure to live up to the values they had sworn to uphold when they enlisted. Private Rodriguez, who had tried to speak up for Sarah earlier, sat quietly near the front of the assembly. He felt a mixture of relief and regret, glad that someone in authority had finally seen what was happening but wishing he had done more to stop it before it reached this point. The lesson he was learning about moral courage was as important as anything he would gain from formal training. Near the back of the hall, Private Wong sat by himself, his presence largely unnoticed by the other recruits. He was the young man whose harassment by Sergeant Phillips had prompted Sarah's initial report, and though most of the recruits were unaware of his connection to recent events, he understood exactly what Sarah had sacrificed to protect him. The guilt he felt about being the indirect cause of her suffering was almost overwhelming, but it was mixed with profound gratitude for someone who had been willing to risk everything for a stranger's welfare. General Hayes entered the hall precisely 10 minutes after her announcement, her bearing commanding immediate attention from everyone present. She had taken time to review additional files and gather information about the recent dynamics among this particular group of recruits. What she had learned had only reinforced her determination to address not just the immediate incident, but the broader cultural issues that had allowed it to develop. The general walked to the front of the hall and stood behind the small podium that had been positioned there for training sessions. She surveyed the assembled recruits for several long moments before speaking, allowing the weight of her presence and the significance of the moment to settle over the group. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the hall, "I had planned to spend this morning conducting routine inspections and reviewing training protocols. Instead, I found myself witnessing a demonstration of both the best and worst aspects of military culture played out in your courtyard for all to see." The silence in the hall was absolute. Even the usual sounds of shifting in seats and quiet breathing seemed muted as every person present focused entirely on the general's words. "Some of you may be wondering why I chose to salute Recruit Martinez in front of your assembled group. Let me be very clear about the reasoning behind that gesture. I saluted her because she demonstrated moral courage of the highest order, not once but multiple times over the past several days." General Hayes paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Recruit Martinez witnessed a fellow soldier being abused by a person in authority. Rather than looking the other way, as too many people do when confronted with difficult situations, she documented the abuse and reported it through proper channels. This action likely prevented further harm to the victim and ensured that an abuser was removed from a position where he could hurt others." Several recruits shifted uncomfortably as they began to understand the full context of Sarah's actions. Many of them had assumed she had reported someone for minor infractions or personal disagreements, not that she had exposed genuine abuse that threatened another recruit's safety and well-being. The response to her moral courage was predictably shameful, the general continued, her tone becoming sharper. "Rather than recognizing her actions as exemplary of military values, some of you chose to harass and isolate her. You turned someone who had demonstrated the highest qualities of military service into a social outcast, simply because she had the strength to do what was right." The weight of guilt was becoming visible on many faces throughout the hall. Private Henderson stared down at his hands, unable to meet the general's gaze as she described behavior he had actively participated in and encouraged. "This morning's incident in the courtyard was the culmination of several days of systematic harassment," General Hayes said. "Recruit Martinez was deliberately given false information about reporting for duty, then left to stand in the rain while others watched and mocked her from the safety of covered areas. This represents a fundamental failure to understand what military service actually means." Private Martinez, unrelated to Sarah despite sharing her surname, felt sick as he listened to the general's description. He had been one of the watchers, had laughed at Sarah's predicament, and had even suggested prolonging her suffering for entertainment. The contrast between his behavior and the courage being described was stark and uncomfortable. "Let me share something with you about military history and the nature of true leadership," the general said, her tone becoming more instructional. "Throughout every conflict in which American forces have served, the difference between victory and defeat has often come down to individual soldiers making difficult moral choices under pressure. The person willing to report corruption in the supply chain, even when it makes them unpopular. The soldier who refuses to participate in actions that violate the laws of war, even when ordered by superiors. The individual who risks their own safety to protect civilians or fellow service members." She gestured toward Sarah without looking directly at her. Recruit Martinez demonstrated exactly this kind of moral courage when she reported the abuse of Private Wong. She knew there would likely be social consequences for her action, but she also knew that failing to act would allow harm to continue. This is precisely the kind of decision-making we need from military leaders at every level. Private Wong felt a moment of shock as his name was mentioned, suddenly understanding that his own experience was connected to the events that had unfolded. He looked toward Sarah with new appreciation for what she had endured on his behalf, feeling a combination of gratitude and responsibility that would influence his own future choices. "Now let me address those of you who participated in harassing Recruit Martinez," the general said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Your behavior demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of military values and the obligations that come with wearing this uniform. You took someone who had shown exceptional courage and made her a target for cruelty. This is the opposite of military leadership. The silence in the hall was becoming oppressive as the full weight of their actions settled on the guilty recruits. What had seemed like harmless fun or justified social pressure was being revealed as a serious failure of character and judgment. In civilian life, your behavior might be dismissed as immature pranking or social dynamics, General Hayes continued. In military service, it represents a failure that could have life and death consequences in combat situations. If you cannot recognize and support moral courage in training, how can you be trusted to make the right decisions when lives are at stake? She paused again, allowing the implications of her words to be fully absorbed by everyone present. Military units succeed or fail based on trust, mutual support, and shared commitment to doing what is right even when it is difficult. What you demonstrated toward Recruit Martinez was the exact opposite of these qualities. Private Coleman felt as though he was shrinking in his seat as the general's words cut through every justification he had constructed for his behavior. The cruel entertainment he had derived from Sarah's suffering was being revealed as a fundamental failure of character that called into question his fitness for military service. I want each of you to consider something, the general said, her tone becoming more reflective. In a few weeks, you will complete basic training and move on to advanced instruction or your first duty assignments. Some of you may eventually find yourselves in leadership positions, responsible for other people's welfare and success. The question you must ask yourselves is this: what kind of leader do you want to be? She began walking slowly across the front of the hall as she spoke, making eye contact with various recruits as she moved. Do you want to be the kind of leader who punishes people for doing the right thing? Who creates environments where moral courage is discouraged and conformity is valued above integrity? Who stands by and watches while others suffer, as long as you remain safe and comfortable? The questions hung in the air like accusations, forcing each listener to confront their own recent choices and their implications for future leadership opportunities. Or do you want to be the kind of leader who recognizes and supports moral courage?